Have you ever felt like someone was your whole world one moment and a complete stranger the next moment? And no matter how hard you tried, you could never find emotional stability with them? One day they are close, warm, and full of attention. The next day, they disappear into silence, distance, and cold energy. And somehow, instead of walking away, you find yourself trying harder, thinking more, and feeling deeper. If this sounds familiar, then you are already inside something far more powerful than love. You are inside a cycle that quietly controls emotions, thoughts, and behavior without you even realizing it. This is not just a relationship problem. This is a psychological pattern that traps two people in a constant push and pull. One person moves closer while the other moves away. One person seeks connection while the other seeks space. And in between these two movements, something very intense is created: confusion, anxiety, obsession, hope, pain, and a strange emotional addiction that feels impossible to break. What makes this even more dangerous is that it rarely feels wrong in the beginning. In fact, it feels like destiny. The connection feels strong, the attraction feels natural, the conversations feel deep and meaningful. There is excitement in the unpredictability. There is emotional intensity that feels like proof of true love. And in those early moments, the mind does not question the stability of the bond. It only feels the thrill of being wanted and the fear of losing something rare. But what most people never realize is that emotional intensity is not the same as emotional safety. And what feels like passion in the beginning slowly turns into confusion over time. Because once the emotional bond starts to deepen, something changes in the behavior of both people. The closeness that once felt exciting starts to feel overwhelming for one person, while the distance that once felt temporary starts to feel threatening for the other. At this point, a silent pattern begins. One person starts to pull away without fully explaining why, not because they do not care, but because closeness triggers something inside them that feels uncomfortable or suffocating. They need space to feel in control again. They need distance to breathe emotionally, and when they step back, the other person immediately feels that shift like a warning signal. Because the other side does not experience distance as peace, they experience it as danger, as rejection, as loss. Their mind starts to fill in the blanks with fear. Did I do something wrong? Are they losing interest? Are they going to leave? And the more unanswered questions appear, the stronger the emotional reaction becomes. Not because they want control, but because their nervous system is trying to restore safety. And this is where the cycle becomes alive. One person moves away to feel safe. The other moves closer to feel safe. But every move that is meant to create safety actually creates more tension. The more one pulls away, the more the other chases. The more one chases, the more the other retreats. And what started as connection slowly turns into emotional chaos. What is important to understand here is that both people are not acting randomly. They are reacting to fear. One fears losing themselves in closeness. The other fears losing the connection completely. And without even realizing it, both are trying to protect themselves, using opposite strategies that collide instead of connect. And this is why so many people stay stuck for so long, because in between the push and pull, there are moments that feel incredibly real. There are moments of warmth after distance. There are moments of closeness after silence. And these moments feel powerful enough to make you believe the relationship is healing, but in reality, they are just temporary resets in a repeating cycle. This emotional pattern becomes even harder to escape because the brain starts adapting to inconsistency. It begins to expect highs after lows. It starts to crave resolution after confusion. And slowly, the nervous system gets trained to stay attached, even when it is hurting, not because you are weak, but because your brain is responding to unpredictability in a way that creates emotional dependency. And this is where most people get trapped without even realizing it. They stop recognizing peace as love. They start recognizing intensity as connection. And they begin to believe that if something feels this strong, it must mean something meaningful, even if it is making them anxious, restless, and emotionally exhausted. But before anything else is understood in this journey, there is something important you need to see clearly. This cycle does not begin with one wrong person and one right person. It begins with two emotional systems trying to find safety in the only ways they know how. And until this is understood, the same pattern will keep repeating in different forms. with different faces, but the same emotional outcome. If you stay until the end of this video, you will not only understand why this cycle happens, but also how it silently shapes your emotions, your choices, and your sense of self. More importantly, you will see how to begin stepping out of it without chasing, without losing yourself, and without repeating the same emotional pain again. At some point, you begin to notice a strange pattern in yourself. You are not reacting to what is happening in front of you. You are reacting to what you fear might happen next. A delayed reply feels like rejection. A short message feels like disinterest. A change in tone feels like distance. And even when nothing is clearly wrong, your mind starts building stories that feel more real than reality itself. This is where confusion quietly takes over the mind, and emotional balance slowly disappears without warning. What makes this even more complex is that it does not feel like imagination in the moment. It feels like intuition. It feels like you are sensing the truth before it is spoken. But in reality, the nervous system has become highly alert to emotional uncertainty. It starts scanning for signs of loss, even when there is no clear evidence. This constant scanning creates mental pressure that never fully turns off, and over time it becomes exhausting to live inside your own thoughts. In this state, peace starts to feel unfamiliar, silence feels uncomfortable, stability feels suspicious, because the mind has been trained through emotional unpredictability to expect change at any moment. So even when things are calm, there is an underlying tension waiting for something to shift again. This is how emotional instability becomes internalized, not because life is chaotic, but because the mind has learned to anticipate chaos. On the other side of this dynamic, there is a completely different internal experience happening. When emotional closeness starts to increase, it can create pressure instead of comfort. Not because there is no care, but because vulnerability feels exposing. Opening up emotionally can feel like losing control, and when that sense of control feels threatened, the natural response is to step back, create distance, and regain internal balance. This withdrawal is often misunderstood. It is not always a decision made out of lack of feeling. It is more often a reflex triggered by emotional intensity. When connection becomes too strong too quickly, the system that values independence starts to feel crowded. And in order to restore a sense of personal space, emotional separation happens almost automatically. The intention is not to destroy connection, but to protect internal stability. However, this protective response sends a powerful signal to the other person. It creates emotional uncertainty that is difficult to interpret because there is no clear ending, only inconsistency. One moment there is engagement and the next moment there is withdrawal. This lack of clarity becomes the perfect environment for overthinking. The mind tries to solve what cannot be logically solved. It searches for meaning in behavior that is driven by emotional reflex, not communication. As this continues, both individuals begin to adjust their behavior without realizing it. One becomes more expressive, more available, more emotionally present, hoping that consistency will bring closeness. The other becomes more reserved, more selective, more detached, hoping that space will bring comfort. Neither person is trying to create distance on purpose. They are both trying to regulate discomfort in their own way, but the result is a widening gap instead of closeness. What makes this pattern so powerful is that it does not stay static. It escalates. Every attempt to fix the situation unintentionally strengthens the imbalance. When one person increases emotional effort, the other feels increased pressure. When the other increases distance, the first person feels increased urgency. Each reaction triggers the opposite reaction, creating a loop that feeds itself without external influence. Over time, this loop begins to shape perception. You start to believe that effort must always be high to maintain connection. You start to believe that love requires constant proof. And you start to believe that inconsistency is normal in deep emotional bonds. These beliefs form silently, but they change the way relationships are experienced. What should feel stable starts to feel unpredictable, and what should feel secure starts to feel uncertain. There is also a deeper psychological mechanism at play here. The human brain is highly responsive to irregular rewards. When positive moments are not consistent but appear unpredictably, they create stronger emotional attachment. This is because the mind becomes focused on when the next moment of connection will happen. Instead of experiencing stability, it begins anticipating relief. and anticipation keeps attention locked in place, even when discomfort is present. This is why leaving such dynamics often feels harder than staying. It is not only emotional attachment, it is also the expectation of relief that keeps the mind engaged. The possibility that the next moment might feel better becomes powerful enough to override current pain. And so, the cycle continues, not because it is fulfilling, but because it is unpredictable. As time passes, emotional fatigue starts to build quietly. The nervous system remains in a constant state of alertness. There are moments of relief, but they never last long enough to create lasting calm. Instead, they reset the cycle again and again. And with each repetition, emotional energy decreases while mental dependency increases. At this stage, many people do not realize how much of their self-worth has become tied to responsiveness and attention. When attention is given, confidence rises. When attention is withdrawn, self-doubt returns. This creates an unstable sense of identity that depends on external behavior instead of internal grounding, and this is one of the most overlooked effects of this pattern. Understanding this layer is important because it shifts the focus away from blame and toward awareness. The issue is not simply about two people failing to connect. It is about two nervous systems trying to protect themselves in ways that unintentionally create conflict. One seeks certainty through closeness, the other seeks safety through distance. And both strategies, while protective, end up clashing in a way that keeps both individuals emotionally stuck. What keeps this dynamic alive is not only emotional reaction, but also the deeper belief system forming underneath it. At first, it feels like you are simply trying to hold on to someone who matters. But slowly, the mind starts interpreting every small shift as something significant about your value. If communication increases, you feel important. If communication decreases, you feel unimportant. Over time, your emotional state becomes dependent on external signals that you cannot control. This is where a hidden psychological trap begins to take shape. The mind starts linking uncertainty with importance. The more unpredictable the situation becomes, the more attention it demands. Instead of stepping back, the brain moves closer, trying to solve the emotional puzzle. It believes that if it understands the pattern, it can finally find relief. But the pattern is not logical. It is emotional, and emotional loops do not break through thinking alone. In the middle of this experience, there are moments that feel like relief. A sudden message after silence. A warm interaction after distance, a brief return of connection after emotional gap. These moments feel powerful because they reduce tension instantly. But what most people do not see is that relief itself becomes part of the attachment. The mind begins to wait for it. It begins to expect it. And without realizing it, the entire emotional system becomes organized around the next moment of comfort. This is why clarity becomes harder to maintain as time goes on. Instead of seeing the full picture, attention gets pulled toward recent emotional changes. Yesterday's distance creates fear. Today's warmth creates hope. And tomorrow's uncertainty creates confusion again. This constant shift prevents emotional stability from forming. The mind never gets enough consistency to settle, so it keeps reacting instead of observing. On the other side of this interaction, the experience is not about pursuit, but about pressure. When emotional closeness increases too quickly or too intensely, it can activate an internal response that feels overwhelming. It is not about lack of interest. It is about internal balance being disrupted. In order to restore calm, withdrawal becomes the natural response. Space is not used as punishment, it is used as regulation. But the problem is that this regulation is not understood by the other side. What feels like relief for one person feels like rejection for the other, and what feels like connection for one feels like pressure for the other. This difference in interpretation creates a widening gap in understanding. Neither side sees the internal experience of the other clearly, only the external behavior. As this misunderstanding continues, communication becomes less direct. Instead of expressing needs clearly, both individuals start adjusting their behavior. One tries to increase closeness through more effort, more availability, and more emotional openness. The other tries to restore comfort through reduced engagement and controlled distance. These adjustments are not intentional strategies. They are emotional reactions shaped by discomfort. However, these reactions create unintended consequences. The more effort is increased, the more pressure is felt. The more space is created, the more anxiety is triggered. This creates a loop where every action produces the opposite emotional outcome than intended. And because both sides are trying to feel better, they continue repeating the same behaviors, hoping for a different result. Over time, this repetition builds emotional exhaustion. The nervous system stays in a constant cycle of activation and recovery without ever fully stabilizing. Moments of connection are followed by moments of withdrawal. Moments of hope are followed by moments of doubt. This rhythm becomes familiar, even if it is painful, and familiarity often feels safer than change, even when it is unhealthy. One of the most subtle effects of this pattern is how it reshapes self-perception. Instead of feeling secure within yourself, your emotional state begins to mirror the relationship's behavior. When things feel close, confidence rises. When things feel distant, self-doubt grows. This creates an unstable internal identity that depends on external validation cycles rather than internal grounding. At this point, the relationship is no longer just about two people interacting. It becomes a system that regulates emotional state. One person's behavior directly influences the other person's sense of stability. And because neither side is fully aware of the pattern they are part of, both continue responding as if they are dealing with isolated moments instead of a repeating structure. What makes this cycle even more difficult to recognize is that both individuals believe they are acting from care. The one who reaches out believes they are showing love and commitment. The one who pulls away believes they are protecting emotional balance. Both intentions are valid on their own, but when combined in this specific pattern, they create instability instead of connection. There is also a deeper reason why this loop feels so hard to exit. The emotional system becomes conditioned to expect fluctuation. Stability can start to feel unfamiliar or even uncomfortable after prolonged inconsistency. When calm finally appears, it may feel empty or uncertain because the nervous system is no longer used to it. This is how emotional conditioning quietly changes perception of normality. As this continues, decision-making becomes influenced more by emotional urgency than long-term clarity. Choices are made in response to current discomfort rather than overall well-being. This leads to repeated attempts to fix or restore connection, even when the structure itself remains unchanged. And each attempt reinforces the same cycle again. The most important realization in this stage is that effort alone does not resolve emotional misalignment. Without understanding the underlying pattern, increased effort simply intensifies the imbalance. What is needed is awareness of how each response is feeding into the system itself. Once this awareness begins to form, the cycle starts to lose its automatic control over behavior. Because at its core, this is not just about attachment or distance. It is about two internal systems trying to find emotional stability in opposite directions, without realizing they are influencing each other at every step. What most people never realize is that this pattern does not continue because it is enjoyable. It continues because the brain becomes trained to expect contrast. When emotional experiences are unpredictable, the mind stops seeking calm consistency and starts seeking resolution to tension. Instead of valuing peace, it begins to prioritize closure after discomfort. This shift happens quietly, but it completely changes how attachment is experienced. At a deeper level, the nervous system starts building sensitivity to emotional fluctuation. Small changes in tone become noticeable. Minor delays feel amplified. Subtle shifts in engagement carry more weight than they should. This heightened sensitivity is not imagination, it is conditioning. The mind has been exposed to enough inconsistency that it now reacts faster and stronger to any signal that resembles separation. In this state, attention becomes locked on monitoring behavior rather than experiencing connection. Instead of being present in the moment, awareness stays focused on interpretation. Every interaction is analyzed for meaning. Every silence is measured for significance, and every response is evaluated against previous patterns. This creates mental overload where even simple communication feels emotionally complex. Meanwhile, the other side of this dynamic experiences something very different internally. When emotional expectations increase, pressure begins to build. Not because connection is unwanted, but because emotional intensity feels difficult to sustain. The need to maintain constant reassurance or engagement can feel draining. In order to restore internal balance, withdrawal becomes a form of self-regulation rather than rejection. but this withdrawal is rarely understood in its true form. It is interpreted through the lens of fear by the other person. What is actually an attempt to regain equilibrium is perceived as loss of interest or emotional detachment. This misinterpretation becomes the foundation of repeated misunderstanding. Each side reacts based on their internal experience without seeing the emotional reality of the other. As this continues, communication begins to lose transparency. Instead of openly expressing emotional states, both individuals start adapting their behavior indirectly. One increases emotional expression in hopes of restoring connection. The other reduces engagement in hopes of restoring calm. These adjustments are not planned decisions. They are automatic responses shaped by internal discomfort. However, these responses create unintended escalation. Increased expression is met with decreased availability. Decreased availability leads to increased emotional urgency, and increased urgency leads to further withdrawal. This creates a self-reinforcing loop where each attempt to restore balance produces further imbalance. Over time, the interaction becomes reactive rather than relational. At this stage, emotional energy begins to fragment. Moments of connection feel short-lived. Moments of distance feel prolonged. And in between these extremes, there is little sense of stability. The mind starts to lose its ability to predict emotional outcomes, which increases internal tension. Predictability is a key requirement for psychological safety. And when it is missing, the body remains in a subtle state of alert. Another important shift begins to happen in perception. Instead of seeing behavior as situational, the mind starts interpreting it as identity-based. Distance becomes associated with emotional unavailability. Effort becomes associated with desperation. Silence becomes associated with rejection. These interpretations are not necessarily accurate, but they feel real because they are formed under emotional stress. This is where misunderstanding deepens significantly. Actions are no longer seen in isolation. They are connected to assumed meaning. And once meaning is attached, it becomes difficult to separate reality from interpretation. This is how small interactions begin to carry emotional weight far beyond their actual intent. Over time, both individuals begin to feel misunderstood. One feels overwhelmed by expectations they never fully agreed to. The other feels neglected by responses they never fully understood. This mutual sense of being unseen creates emotional distance even in moments of interaction. Physical or verbal connection may still exist, but emotional alignment starts to weaken. As emotional misalignment increases, effort begins to feel less effective. What once brought closeness now brings frustration. What once created reassurance now creates confusion. This shift is particularly painful because it feels like progress is reversing, but in reality, it is not regression. It is the result of accumulated miscommunication within a repeating structure. At this point, many people try to increase effort even more, believing that intensity can fix inconsistency. They try to communicate more clearly, express more deeply, or engage more frequently. But without addressing the underlying cycle, increased effort often amplifies the same imbalance. It strengthens the very pattern it is trying to fix. On the opposite side, withdrawal often becomes more pronounced as pressure increases. The need for space becomes stronger when emotional demand feels higher. This is not avoidance of care. It is protection of internal stability. But from the outside, it appears as emotional distancing, which triggers even more anxiety on the other side. This mutual reinforcement creates a narrowing emotional corridor. Each person feels they have fewer options for response. One feels that reaching out is necessary, the other feels that stepping back is necessary. And both actions, while intended to solve discomfort, end up reinforcing the same loop. Eventually, emotional exhaustion becomes a shared experience, not because either person stopped caring, but because the system itself demands constant adjustment without resolution. There is effort, but no lasting stabilization. There is connection, but no sustained security. And this imbalance slowly drains emotional capacity over time. The most difficult part of this stage is that it often feels personal. Each person may believe they are failing in some way, but what is actually happening is structural. The interaction pattern itself is producing the outcome, regardless of individual intention. Without recognizing this, both individuals continue trying to solve a problem that is not located in effort alone, but in the way responses are interacting with each other. And this is where awareness begins to become essential, because without it, the cycle does not slow down. It simply continues under different circumstances, repeating the same emotional experience in new forms.